Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are with our keynote for the 9th International Congress of Gothic Literature. We need to thank all the people that have made it all possible, especially Cátedra Alfonso Reyes from Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico, Ana Laura Santamaría and all her team, also to the program Passion for Reading, as well as Tecnológico de Monterrey. And I'm welcoming our keynote for this edition of the Congress. She's Megan de Virgilis, PhD in Spanish from Temple University. She's an assistant professor of Spanish and Latin American and Caribbean Studies coordinator at Morgan University. Her teaching interests include Latin American cultural production and civilizations, as well as translation. Her research centers on the relationship between ideology and cultural production, with special focuses on Gothic literature, horror film, and gender studies. Her keynote for today is titled Reproducing Terror, Gothic Beginnings in Latin America. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you to the organizers of the International Gothic Congress for inviting me to share my thoughts on the Gothic mode in Latin America with you today. These are not at all the circumstances I imagined when Tony Alcalá and I first began talks about this event almost 2 years ago. But I found that in this mess of a year, it's actually of great joy and comfort to get lost in Gothic ruins, lugubrious landscapes, haunted houses, and vampire tales. We are living in a time of collective panic and uncertainty, and the Gothic thrives under these conditions. So we find ourselves here, contending with our past that continues to haunt us and a future that may or may not save us. Either way, I'm thrilled to be here with you today to discuss our monsters and our own monstrosities. I'd like to begin this talk by addressing a scene in Jorge Michel Grau's cannibal coming-of-age film, Somos lo que hay. In the film, a family struggles to find cohesion and their next meal after the death of the patriarch. In this particular scene, a mother and her youngest son are on their way to return the battered corpse of a prostitute that her sons had brought home alive earlier in the evening for their cannibal ritual. In a fit of rage, Patricia, the mother, bludgeoned the prostitute to death. Now in the car, Patricia accuses her youngest son, Julian, of always defending his older brother, Alfredo, a reaction to her feeling sidelined. She recounts how as children, the boys were inseparable, how they used to wrap themselves up and say they were a taco, excluding their sister Sabina, whose only option was to be the salsa. She lets the memory sit for a moment and then utters, Somos unos monstruos, Julian. We're monsters, as if realizing it for the first time. This scene is crucial to the greater message of the film, in that the outer layer of this anything but maternal character, angry, controlling, violent, peels open for a brief moment, letting both the viewer and her son see that she is a complex character whose grief spurs self-reflection, regret, and nostalgia. In a departure from the trend in familial horror of depicting middle and upper-class families, usually in a way that supports the self-other and victim-monster dichotomies, this is a family in poverty where the distinction between good and evil is blurred, suggesting that both can live within us, especially within a corrupt and exploitative society. The line, Somos unos monstruos, stands out because it points to a greater trend in Latin American narratives to explore and define Latin American monstrosity from the inside, to contend with the savage and monstrous other stereotype imposed upon it since the early days of colonialism. As Carlos Jauregui notes, and I quote, since the first encounters, Europeans reported cannibals all over the place, creating a sort of semantic affinity between cannibalism and America. In the 16th and 17th century, the New World was culturally, religiously, and geographically constructed as some sort of cannibalia, end quote. Even today, the myth persists because it has become embedded in the fabric of not only colonial discourse, but in how Latin Americans view themselves and their origins. From Sor Juana's mystic poems to Borges's Minotaur and beyond, Latin American authors have established the connection between themselves and monstrosity, taking ownership of various images imposed upon them. Without a doubt, this has been a traumatic historical and cultural process, but these traumas have arguably nourished what can be considered a unique Latin American Gothic tradition. I think that the Gothic mode, as experienced in Latin America, is nourished by the same dialectics that nourished its European and US counterparts: good versus evil, Catholic versus non-Catholic, past versus present, etc., but on its own terms, as products of its own history and realities, and in some cases, turning certain dichotomies on their heads by exposing their arbitrariness. My approach to Gothic literature in Latin America, then, is similar to Gabriel Eljaik Rodriguez's theory of a tropicalización de lo gótico. But it is nuanced in terms of scope and approach to both historical processes and cultural products. To be able to read the Gothic in Latin America, we need to go back to the beginning, to return to the 19th century and its first examples, and even more so to the fantastic and modernista stories written at the turn of the 20th century. Here is where the seeds of the contemporary Latin American Gothic tradition are planted. My approach is therefore historical and ideological, specifically adopting a feminist lens to understand how themes, forms, and trends in late 19th century Latin American Gothic convey a uniquely female space ripe with domestic and social horrors that could not otherwise be translated into images. My talk today will therefore begin broadly in scope, exploring the European and Latin American Gothic traditions in order to challenge the idea that a European Protestant Enlightenment is a necessary facet in the emergence and development of the Gothic. I will then narrow my scope to explore specific texts, trends, tropes, and their implications to support the idea that the Gothic was alive and well in Latin America before the 20th century, and that these early examples laid the groundwork for what would become a rich and adaptive literary tradition. European and US Gothic scholars have overwhelmingly agreed on the idea that the Gothic is only possible in regions that experienced a Protestant Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was the age of reason, logic, scientific and medical advancement, progress, urbanization, revolutionary thought, and order. But this order was intrinsically linked to chaos and monstrosity. This can be evidenced in the break from feudal values, whereby the emerging bourgeoisie found that the only means to effect order through change was to revolt. Paul Elie suggests that the Age of Enlightenment was actually the age of both reason and counter-rational reason, relating the century to the seemingly contradictory qualities of Minerva, the goddess of order and chaos. He opines that the counter-rational was produced because reason depended solely on the observable, thus ignoring the imagination. The Gothic genre is nourished by this counter-rational reason, and therefore a response to European ideological processes. Understood as a genre, the Gothic pertains to the specific ideological coordinates of the rise of the bourgeoisie and the division between the public and private spheres. It is the space that occupies and expresses the vulnerabilities and excesses of modernity. Latin America did not experience the Enlightenment in the same way as Europe. Neither did Spain, a strongly censored and religious country that rejected French ideas and experienced a persistence of superstitious beliefs. As Miriam Lopez Santos suggests, Spain did experience a moral and nationalist enlightenment that managed to form within the generally anti-Iluminista, anti-intellectualista, y anti-laicista Spanish society. Across the Atlantic, Latin America was still under Spain's colonial rule and influences. But whereas Spain was not ready to leave its feudal past behind, what can be said of Latin America? A conglomerate of colonies with a semi-feudal past, an argument based on its feudal relations of production and encomienda systems, which in many places persevered through the 19th century. Clearly, the region lacked the traditional tensions and dialectics necessary to nourish a European-style Gothic, such as castles and ruins, bourgeois revolutions, and Catholicism viewed as other. And as Victor Sage points out, British Gothic fiction originated in the 18th century as a direct response to anxieties regarding Catholicism. And yet, the Gothic is evident in Latin American cultural production. Not the genre as traditionally conceived between 1764 and 1820, but the Gothic mode. Let's take a brief look at the European Gothic. Against a backdrop of castles in ruins, damsels in distress, evil aristocrats, and an unruly natural environment, Gothic's purpose can be considered twofold: to express the wrongs of the present through fear and a strict moral code, and to encourage a divergence between the past and the present, or between civilized and barbaric forces, practices, nations, people, etc. Unlike the rationalist essays and moralist fables of earlier 18th century writings, the Gothic produced an emotional response in its readers. Not only then were the themes distinctive in their representations of a not so distant feudal past, but this new trend in aesthetics based on emotions, based on elevating the reader's senses to the point of experiencing sublime terror, was central to Gothic fiction. This interest in the human sensory experience was not specific to the Gothic, but rather a continuation of the fascination on the subject that began to be explored in mid-18th century Enlightenment texts, such as Edmund Burke's A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Ideas on the Sublime and the Beautiful, and Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment. These ideas were later explored by Anne Radcliffe. In On the Supernatural in Poetry, she states, and I quote, "Terror and horror are so far opposite that the first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life. The other contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them," end quote. The Gothic, therefore, does not operate in opposition to these ideas on individualism, sensory experience, and the possibilities and limitations of science and nature, but rather in accordance with them. In an increasingly secular society where reason and logic soon proved insufficient in explaining humankind's many universal uncertainties, and where language proved insufficient in expressing the ineffable, Gothic made it possible to transcend the empirical reality by reconfiguring the individual and the rules by which she is governed. The general consensus among scholars is that the Gothic was a particular genre of novels that spanned a 60 or so year period that began with the publication of Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto in 1764 and ended with the publication of Charles Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer in 1820. Such a classification, however, neglects the fact that Gothic tendencies can be observed both much earlier and later than the specific timeframe allows, in addition to glazing over the folkloric origins of these motifs. That said, the Gothic is clearly a modern method of expression, or more specifically, a form of representing tensions and anxieties produced within these specific ideological coordinates that, at least in modern literary form, began in the 18th century. Fred Botting addresses these Gothic beginnings, opining that the Gothic can first be observed in graveyard poetry of the early 18th century, where English poets described shadows, darkness, melancholy, ghosts, and other aesthetic qualities that fell outside the rational. On the other side of the spectrum is the rich history of Gothic literature, produced after the confines of this 60-year mark, a global phenomenon that expands the source of production to marginal spaces wherein it adapts to meet regional literary trends and historical realities, and that, in effect, can be suggested to reduce Europe's role to a mere template, and oftentimes a template to parody. The Gothic mode, then, can lend itself to many genres and does not require feudal trappings, length, plot lines, narrative structure, or a specific time frame or place of publication to determine its presence. Instead, the effects produced in the reader can be considered the most important aspect. It can be understood as a literature of nightmares, usually provoking an ambiguous sense of time and space as one of the ways it subverts logic and represents the concerns and tensions of the present, whatever present that may be, whether they are ideological tensions, economic, or political. Themes such as incest, guilt and repression, familial anxieties, death, darkness, nightmares, and dreamlike states are common, as are frightening, albeit not essential, figures such as vampires, ghosts, savage beasts, and haunted houses. Latin America, therefore, could express the chaos of urbanization and modernization, or lack thereof in many respects, in dark depictions of city streets, criminals, vampires, sexual deviants, ghosts, and other terrifying representations in the literature of the time. This, of course, was not particular to Latin America, as the European Gothic saw a shift from feudal rural landscapes to middle-class manners and eventually to urban settings, as Alexandra Warwick has observed. The dark side of modernity can be perceived in such works as Eduardo Wilde's Alma Callejera from 1882, where the spirit of a man travels through a dark cityscape to sneak into his loved one's sleeping body, and Eduardo Ladislao Homburg's Horacio Caliban o Los Autómatas from 1879, where the protagonist finds it difficult to differentiate between automatons and real people. Latin American authors also employed modern Gothic tropes and trappings to contend with their colonial traumas. Even though Latin America lacks a typical feudal past, it is not to say that its past was any less barbaric. In addition to the representations of Latin America's peoples and landscapes in literature and chronicles of the conquest, their violent history has been depicted from both an external and an internal perspective. From an external perspective, colonial maps not only served cartographic purposes, but also the purposes of colonial practices, affirming power structures and othering new lands and peoples. As Alhaix Rodriguez observes, and I quote, "Since its colonial beginnings, the American continent as such was constructed as a place of horror," end quote. With respect to the atrocities committed by the Spaniards against indigenous communities, one may think of, for instance, the horrors depicted by Bartolomé de las Casas in his infamous Brevísima Historia de la Destrucción de las Indias from 1552. From an internal perspective, the narrative voice in José María Heredia's poem in El Teocalli de Cholula ponders the glorious but brutal indigenous past with its horrors expressed through the sublime aesthetic. In contemporary literature, Julio Cortázar's La Noche Boca Arriba comes to mind, where a member of the Moteca tribe experiences a fantastic dream sequence before being sacrificed to the Aztec gods, as well as Augusto Monterroso's El Eclipse, which depicts the Spanish monk as less cunning and intelligent than the indigenous people who determine his fate. And Carlos Fuentes's Chacmul and Aura, in both of which, as Carmen Serrano has noted, and I quote, "The doubles ask for small offerings and, eventually, for human life in order to continue their existence, thus restaging Mesoamerican sacrificial ceremonies to the gods," end quote. Somos lo que hay adheres to this logic as well, where the pre-colonial past brutally, vengefully, but also justifiably continues to haunt the present. From an external gaze, Latin America is barbaric, in the sense that it was illegible, too different to be understood, and thus needed to be conquered and rewritten. From an internal gaze, it acknowledges its barbarity and its reclaiming and at times mythologizing of its past. Before the last 5 years or so, critical studies on the Gothic in Latin America were scant. Attempts to articulate Gothic tendencies in Latin American literature before the recent upswing include a chapter in Cynthia Duncan's Unraveling the Real and Julio Cortázar's brief Notas sobre lo gótico en el Río de la Plata, where he states, "Creo que sin Ligea, sin la caída de la Casa de los Usher, no se hubiera dado en mí esa disponibilidad a lo fantástico, que me asalta en los momentos más inesperados y que me lleva a escribir como única manera posible de atravesar ciertos límites, de instalarme en el terreno de lo otro. In the last few years, scholars have attempted to tackle the gap in scholarship more directly, and with great success. The burgeoning field of Gothic studies in Latin America is indebted to foundational texts such as Sandra Casanova Vizcaíno and Inés Ordiz's Latin American Gothic in Literature and Culture, Tony Alcalá and Ilse Busing's Doubles and Hybrids in Latin American Gothic, Carmen Serrano's Gothic Imagination in Latin American Fiction and Film, and El Hayek Rodriguez's Selva de Fantasmas, and The Migration and Politics of Monsters in Latin American Cinema. To complement the existing literature that is more precisely focused on contemporary representations in film, my analysis will focus on a select corpus of 19th and early 20th century short stories that reproduce European Gothic models to express anxieties related to shifting notions on sex and gender, marriage, and gender-determined spaces. In the post-independence era, when the search for national identities incited a rejection of Spanish and later United States policies and institutions, these writers display how anxieties over origins, otherness, nationhood, and modernization were inextricably linked to questions of gender and women's role, treatment, and representation in patriarchal society. As Francine Maciello observes, women were central to nation-building processes, and intellectuals molded an image of woman to suit their projects of state, which included restricting women to the private sphere to train future citizens. The rise of feminism and the new woman challenged this image, but the visibility of women in the public sphere can be directly linked to an increase in representations of monstrous female characters. As Carol A. Senft notes, and I quote, "The growing 19th century interest in powerful women characters may have stemmed from its concern, even obsession, with women's actual power, an obsession that increased as the century progressed," end quote. In Latin America, and particularly in Argentina, an anarchist feminist movement took shape, and writers and intellectuals, such as Leopoldo Lugones, inserted themselves in the debate on the woman question, which he explores in his essays La educación de la mujer, lo que es y lo que debe ser from 1893, and La cuestión feminista from 1897. There are examples of this in Gothic-inspired historical novels as well, such as in Juan José Nieto Gil's Rosina o la prisión del Castillo de Chagres from 1850, and Luisa Pérez de Zambrana's La hija del verdugo from 1865, both published as serial novels in local Colombian and Cuban newspapers, respectively. Anxieties over the nation were therefore easily translated into anxieties over the family, which the Gothic tradition is more than well suited to express, as it can be understood as a response to the vulnerabilities of the nuclear family structure. Women are center stage in these stories, but in a departure from the European predecessors, Latin American authors reproduce Gothic by inverting the monster-other dichotomy, representing sympathetic women characters, and either leaving marital woes unresolved or outright parroting them. I do not pretend that my corpus is exhaustive, nor can I, for the purposes of time, provide a close reading of these texts, but my hope is that this corpus and approach will show that Latin America's Gothic tradition is indebted to an original female Gothic tradition that continues to nourish the mode well into the 21st century. It is important to note that the term female Gothic has been contested since it was first coined by Ellen Moores in 1976 in her groundbreaking study, Literary Women. Departing from Moore's definition of the term, which restricts the concept to women-authored texts, and also departing from more specific recent terms, such as feminist Gothic and post-feminist Gothic, I'm applying the term liberally as a gender-inclusive and not necessarily feminist concept, in line with what Diana Wallace and Andrew Smith have suggested as a broad and fluid category. Although I apply the term liberally, I also understand the female Gothic to be a space for anxieties on sex, gender, and marriage to play out. In many cases, if these texts don't explicitly challenge these norms, they at least question them or draw attention to their inconsistencies. The first stage of the female Gothic in Latin America is evident in women-authored texts. Gothic and romantic tropes abound in Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda's Tradiciones from 1860, wherein stories such as La Ondina del Lago Azul, a man's obsession with a water nymph, determines his tragic fate, and Juana Manuela Gorriti's Coincidencias from 1867, where characters find themselves trapped in spaces and institutions, either physically or metaphorically. In the second stage, modernist authors experiment with Gothic and decadent tropes, especially the dying or dead woman. Prime examples are Rubén Darío's Thanatopia from 1893, where a young Englishman recounts his horrific encounter with his vampiric stepmother, Leopoldo Lugones's La Vampira from 1899, in which a beautiful widow charms a young man that never stood a chance. Clemente Palma's La Granja Blanca from 1904, a dark and grotesque tale of a newlywed couple plagued by sickness and other horrors, such as the possibility of incest and pedophilia. And Clemente Palma's Vampiras from 1906, a satirical take on Bram Stoker's Dracula, where a young man experiences a mysterious illness later attributed by his doctor to his innocent but sexually curious girlfriend. The cure? Marriage. I'm limiting my analysis to narratives, but it's of course important to mention Delmira Agustini's Gothic-inflected modernista poems, such as El Vampiro. Finally, in the early 20th century, the female Gothic transcends earlier models to more directly tackle Latin America's place in both the Gothic tradition and modernity. Horacio Quiroga's El Almohadón de Plumas from 1917 and El Vampiro from 1927 are prime examples. The first is the tragic tale of newlyweds' strange romance that ends in the wife's death, while the second is a story cloaked in the awe and anxieties of technological advancement that also represents strong imperial anxieties regarding foreign presence in Latin America. For the remainder of my talk, I'd like to briefly discuss three of these stories in particular, one from each stage. In Juana Manuela Gorriti's Una Visita Infernal, a female narrator details her sister's two encounters with a mysterious man, first on her wedding night, and later as an old woman walking down the street. In the first encounter, she is 18 years old, waiting for her husband to leave their wedding reception and whisk her away on their honeymoon. As she waits with her alma llena de gratas ilusiones, she hears footsteps, and then suddenly a tall, dark man dressed in black with a unibrow approaches her. The candle dims and she hears her husband's voice before she passes out in this other man's arms, but later wakes up in her husband's arms on the way to their honeymoon destination. She tells him what happened and he laughs off her story, but then her story is somewhat corroborated in the second encounter, where she sees the same man walking down the street. She asks a passerby who the man is, and he responds that he's the devil. But she soon realizes that this passerby escaped from a mental institution and was in fact crazy, leaving the reader to interpret what really happened on their wedding night. Gorriti is typically associated with romantic expression, but recently there is renewed interest in her work as Gothic. This story in particular adheres to Gothic conventions: a suffering heroine, the appearance of an abusive male figure, suspense, the use of claroscuro, to name a few, and it is clearly ripe with social and marital anxieties. By taking place on the night of the wedding, as many Gothic and vampire tales tend to do, it establishes a connection between marriage, instability, and terror. This is most clear in the fact that as this mysterious man embraces the female protagonist, she hears the voice of her husband, Her assault then can be understood as her losing her virginity to her husband on her wedding night. But the force or fear associated with the act may have caused her to reimagine the scenario differently. By reading this scene as a violent or simply unwanted sexual encounter helps explain the reappearance of the man at the end. She's essentially triggered by someone she sees on the street, and then leads herself to believe that, like the passerby, she has gone mad. In this sense, the story adheres to Michele Massey's concept of the marital Gothic, and I quote, "A later form of the genre where the husband is present at the beginning rather than at the end of the story and repeats the role of the father. The trope of the husband allows us to consider how and why the figure who is supposed to lay horror to rest has himself become the avatar of horror who strips voice, movement, property, and identity itself from the heroine." End quote. As this story shows, marriage does not live up to her expectations, instead leaving her traumatized. The second story I'd like to discuss is Leopoldo Lugones's La Vampira, originally published in the Argentine journal Tribuna, and then collected in Las Primeras Letras de Leopoldo Lugones by his son Polo. The story is narrated in the first person by a witness to the tragic relationship that unfolds between his friend Adolfo and a woman known only as La Vampira. She is a rich, mysterious, and beautiful widow whose description encompasses both pre-Raphaelite images of women and the stereotypical femme fatale. Cold, passive, and expressionless at times, but she is also tall and majestic, independent, and according to the townspeople, spendthrift with her dead husband's money, and has a history of spurned lovers. She is thus seen as the ultimate consumer of men and their money. In this way, the text initially conforms to the late 19th century femme fatale tradition, wherein women are viewed as both sexually and economically threatening. But the way the story later unfolds suggests otherwise. Later in the story, La Vampira confesses a dark secret to Adolfo. She claims that she loved her husband furiously and that they were wildly happy. But then one day he became melancholy and took ill. And before either of them realized that it was their love that was killing him, it was too late. In an effort to save him, she tried to ignore his advances, but she would eventually exceed. And with every touch, she absorbed more and more of him, his body, his thoughts, and his soul, until he finally passed away one night. At first, she was shocked, and this later gave way to guilt, but finally to joy, because they had realized what had once seemed impossible, two people in love becoming one. She then had to hide her secret, a part of her that was making her more arrogant and hostile every day. Her, quote, feminine characteristics were in constant conflict with her husband's masculine characteristics, aggressive impulses, hate, and jealousy. So when she began to fall in love with Adolfo, she also began to hate him. In a reversal of the vampiric femme fatale tradition of the late 19th century, the monstrous female entity is not only motivated by love, but her more glaring negative qualities are attributed to masculine impulses, not feminine ones. She knew that her love would eventually destroy Adolfo as well, so she asked him to leave after confiding in him, but he later returns. At this particular meeting, she agrees to kiss him because something in the air makes her hostile feelings subside for a moment. But then they suddenly return, and she strangles Adolfo to death. At the end of the story, the narrator laments his friend's death and discloses that La Vampira is still alive. Typically, whether they be men or women, vampires die at the end of the story. For example, Dracula's Lucy has a stake driven through her heart, Carmilla is staked, decapitated, and burned, and Clarimond crumbles into a pile of dust and bones after being doused with holy water. Lugones's vampire, however, lives on, albeit in a state of epilepsy from which she does not recover, which adds to her sympathetic portrayal. This story is clearly one of consumption, both material and spiritual. But although she is La Vampira, the text suggests that her husband is the one who encourages his own consumption and not the other way around. And I quote from the text, "Su alma caía gota a gota en el ser de la amada, transfundíase del pobre vaso de su cuerpo en el magnífico vaso donde pusiera toda su vida para adorarla mejor." End quote. Here it is clear that he not only cooperates with his vampirization, but that he actually motivates it. Given that her body hosts her husband, and that in doing so, he is able to influence her thoughts and behaviors, it seems more appropriate to consider her a victim of consumption or vampirization rather than a consumer or vampire herself. The final story I'd like to explore is Horacio Quiroga's El Almohadón de Plumas, arguably the most well-known Latin American vampire tale. Although Quiroga and this story are rarely associated with Gothic literature, with notable exceptions being studies by Anna Reid, Margot Glantz, and Persephone Bram. El Almohadón is a typical Gothic vampire tale in the sense that a female victim is repeatedly attacked at night in her bed to the point of dying from blood loss. But it is atypical for two major reasons. First, marriage is not represented as a unifying or sacred institution. And second, it is the male instead of the female character whose morality remains in question. Similar to Palma's Cordelia in La Granja Blanca, Alicia suffers from a serious disease, and in this case anemia, which takes a quick and destructive toll on her body. As her sickness progresses, the doctors seem perplexed, and the head doctor tells her husband, Jordan, to prepare for the worst. Quite upset, yet suspiciously distant, Jordan paces the halls of their cold, white mansion and never appears to eat or rest. Meanwhile, Alicia is no longer able to leave her bed, progressing from hallucinations and night terrors to continuously whispering delusions in an unconscious state. After her death, the maid sees specks of blood on Alicia's pillow. She hands it over to Jordan, who discovers the cause of Alicia's death, a large, viscous insect that had been consuming her blood while she lay in her bed. According to the narrator, these types of parasites tend to feed off birds, but they prefer human blood. And it is not entirely rare to find them hiding in feather pillows, even reaching enormous proportions under certain conditions. This attempt at a rational explanation of the events brings the sensation of terror full circle. But it also creates a problem for the reader, who finds the last paragraph to read more like a tale or legend than a scientific certainty, and who is unwilling to accept that Jordan is completely innocent. Several critics have addressed the similarities between Jordan and the home, and I would like to add that it is Jordan's embrace of his wife outside in their garden that leads her to collapse, and soon after she takes ill, to be confined for the remainder of her days in her home, which was supposed to have offered her the security and beauty she dreamt of as a child. Critics have also addressed the possibility of the insect being Jordan's double, to which I'd like to add that this doubling takes on a more sinister notion if we focus on Alicia's blood loss and confinement to the bedroom, where she also screams Jordan's name in horror, which could be suggested as representing the loss of freedoms and the possibility of domestic violence married women are exposed to, both of which are typical of female Gothic fiction. To support this idea, let's turn to Zizek, who suggests that any horror narrative can be understood by eliminating the horror element, revealing what the story is really about. In this case, if the insect in the feather pillow were to be removed, then the story would be about an unfulfilling and cruel marriage. What makes this story uniquely Latin American is the reference to a savage natural landscape and the insect itself, making this story an interesting combination of marital and post-colonial anxieties. To conclude, both the Gothic and Latin America are marginalized spaces and concepts that developed through distinct historical and ideological processes. The Gothic as a response to fears over the transition from feudal to mercantile modes of production, the rise of the bourgeoisie, and the subsequent public-private divide. And Latin America, strictly speaking with respect to its being written as a savage yet tameable space for colonizing purposes. Both live on the periphery of modernity, but also make modernity possible. And more importantly, both have evolved over the years in order to survive outside the confines of Europe and the United States. The Gothic in Latin America can also be understood as a continuous process of decolonization, produced in line with a series of historical and literary processes that hit their stride at the turn of the 20th century. By reproducing Gothic forms to suit their own needs and represent their own concerns and realities, Latin American authors continue to challenge dominant Western discourses of normativity, monstrosity, otherness, civilization, morality, and the Gothic itself. Circling back to Somos lo que hay, this reproducing is no more evident than in Sabina herself. Once the sister left on the sidelines, unable to step into her father's shoes because of her gender, in the end, she's the sole survivor of a shootout with police, left to carry out the cannibalistic ritual on her own. She was the one in power behind the scenes, but now she has officially entered the market, represented literally in this image from her stepping into an outdoor market, where she understands that she can use her strength to lure in victims. She has overcome her grief and is now standing in the ashes of patriarchal conservatism. The bourgeois traditional model has become obsolete, and we as viewers cannot help but cheer her on. This emotional nudge is supported by a change from somber chamber music to a plucky and hopeful crescendo, and the look of triumph in her eyes. We can see in Sabina that the female Gothic has come a long way since its first stages, but it is clearly indebted to Gorriti, Gómez de Avellaneda, and even Lugones, Palma, and Quiroga, authors that reproduced European models of terror to express their own anxieties over women's place and treatment, both in the home and outside it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Megan, for this insightful keynote. Of course, it has given more than one a great choice of things to read, to watch, and to keep understanding the, as you mentioned at the beginning, the tropicalization of the Gothic in Latin America. People are leaving some congratulation messages and some questions in the Facebook. And a couple of questions that I have for you are these. Let's consider that traditionally the Gothic is full of liminal spaces, hybrid bodies, all of them questioning the existence of borders, making it evident the need for dialogue in between opposites. So the question based on this is, if you would say that the hybrid origins of Latin American identity provide a fertile ground for Gothic and for a Gothic boom in the region.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as I said, and I touched on this in my talk when I talked about the dialectics, right, that nurture the Gothic. Those dialectics are present, but the way that they are present in Latin America, of course, has to do with this hybridity, right? And when we talk about the pre-colonial past and then the present or post-colonial, yeah, then absolutely, you can see that. And then, of course, the Gothic is why I'm saying is providing this unique form of Gothic literature in Latin America.
Thank you. One more we have from Ilse Bossing. She's asking, she mentions that she's curious to hear your opinion about this story from a different angle. If you were to stray from the notion of the story as a vampiric tale and relate it to the eco-Gothic concerns, and in parentheses she adds, the parasite in the pillow as an extension of vengeful nature, how do you interpret this insect's vicious nature?
It's a great question. I think that when it comes to Quiroga, he really does need to be looked at through this lens of the eco-Gothic. When we look at La Miel Silvestre and Anaconda and his other stories where it's this a la deriva, right, where it's a serpent that kills the man or whatever it may be, it's definitely important to think about it in terms that this landscape, however much it may be mythologized, needs to be respected. And it's that part of Latin America, the past, present, that nature is connected to, and it needs to be respected and reevaluated and represented in this literature. So I think Quiroga does an excellent job of that, and I definitely understand taking that approach to a lot of his stories.
Okay, thank you. And Adele Newsom-Horst is curious about the possibility of an African Latina tradition or contributions. I don't know if you have any idea of possible approaches on this focus.
It's a great question and something I am dying to explore more in the future. Right now, I study mainly 19th century and early 20th century literature, but so I haven't come across this yet, but I think, I mean, there are, of course, there are African and Latin, Afro-Latin representations, of course, in literature and film, and contributions from different Afro-Latin communities in cultural production in Latin America. But in terms of the Gothic itself, that's something I'd like to explore, and something that needs to be a focus of future studies for sure.
Connected to that, Julio Fernandez is asking, he's congratulating for a very thorough and detailed examination of Latin American Gothic, and he's asking if you can recommend any contemporary 20th Latin American female writers who treat Gothic extensively in their work.
Latin American film
female writers who treat the Gothic extensively.
So again, I tend to focus more on 19th century. I did want to open it to kind of bring in this idea of how the 19th century and these seeds of the Latin American Gothic continue to nourish this tradition through the 21st century. However, when it comes to 21st century Gothic, there are, I mean, Carlos Fuentes, even though he's considered more a boom writer, his short novel Vlad there's so much there to think about. Of course, Jorge Michel Grau's Somos lo que hay, which was one of only two, as far as I can tell, one of only two Mexican films that were ever remade in Hollywood. And then there's Carmen Buyosa, who I think would really fit in. I didn't have enough time to talk about that, but would also fit in terms of this female Gothic tradition.
And that's for writers. Now for your production, for your research, Arely Pantoja is asking if there is some place where she can read your research, your books, your texts.
Sure. I mean, I graduated I graduated with my PhD 2 years ago. So my dissertation, I think you can just find online. And a lot of this I do cover, not in terms of a female Gothic tradition. I kind of started to get at that in my dissertation, and something I've honed more since graduating. But I have a lot of a more extensive analysis of Leopoldo Lugones's short story, which was published in March of 2009 in Bulletin of Hispanic Studies. And the reason I think I also had Jorge Michel Grau's film on my mind so much is this past summer I wrote a chapter on this film that's going to come out in Screening Loss through Liverpool University Press. So it's an edited volume. So that's what I can say now. If you're interested in my work on feminism in the Gothic, this Lugones article in Bulletin of Hispanic Studies, and then this chapter that will come out, I think, early next year in Screening Loss.
Now that you're mentioning this scope towards the future, you commented in your presentation that there is a requirement for an enlightened background for the Gothic to arise. Another requirement we know is that there is the need in the area where the Gothic takes place, the need to express anxieties about origins, about the future. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, given the present discussion around gender, class issues in Latin America, what future do you anticipate in the region for the Gothic?
That's interesting. So I think that definitely we're going to see in terms of, from what I can see in contemporary representations, are definitely directly this more direct tackling of, as you say, class and gender issues. Clearly, we're seeing characters that are not middle and upper class. We're seeing characters that are more marginalized, and how that may represent. I think that speaks directly to Latin America's place or continued marginalization, first from Europe and then the United States over the course of history. So I think that seeing that is very refreshing, and I think that and also this with women characters. So I think we're going to continue to see more of that for sure.
Okay, thank you, Megan. So I don't know if you have any words as conclusion for your presentation.
Just that, I mean, I'm glad that these questions are being asked and that there's interest in the work and that there's other scholars studying this and thinking about what I have discussed in terms of different lenses or connecting it to different things. So I really appreciate that. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm at Morgan State, please do so if anyone has any other questions or anything. I appreciate it.
Okay, Megan, we appreciate a lot your contribution today. Thanks again for being here. Thanks again to our audience. And we just invite you to continue today at 4 o'clock Central Time US, 4 o'clock as well in Mexico City. We will have the fourth panel, which is around the topics also that we're gathering in this Congress, is the internationalization of the Gothic. We will have stuff on the fin de siècle, on World War Z, on No Longer Human, and as well on Guignol Theater. So thanks, Megan. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Catedral Alfonso Reyes. It was nice to have all of you here.
Thank you.
Bye to everyone.